Just who were the Romans? Talk number 6 in a planned series of 9. Title I've given this one is Taken Over by the Generals. At the end of talk number 5, I left you with a sort of cliffhanger. Who's going to take over Rome now? Are the Senate going to recover their authority? Are the old patrician families going to regain their superiority? Is it going to be the People's Assembly who make it truly democratic? Is it going to be run by those who are in charge of rent-a-mob? Is it going to be the knights, the equites? Well, the answer, as you will have gathered from the title, wasn't any of those. It was the generals. It became a military organization. The whole process, start to finish, I suppose, lasted about 70 years. We can take an overall view of it. Historians are wonderful. With their hindsight, they know everything. They can see everything. They can understand everything, analyze everything, see things coming. You're living at the time, you can't. But now, looking back, yes, it seemed as if there was a roughly 70-year process in which gradually, but relentlessly, the generals gained more and more power until in the end they were running the show. The last battle of all in 31 BC, when a young man called Octavian beat the fleet of Mark Antony and Cleopatra and took over the Roman Empire. That was the last rivalry that Octavian had to put up. So how had all this come about? The end of a process, as I said, which historians can see had been going on for the best part of 70 years. What exactly had been going on? Well, in a word, war. As the Romans got stronger, as their authority spread, as they traded more, as their fleets and armies got bigger and bigger, they conquered rivals, of course, but the conquest of rivals led only to the appearance of more, and they found themselves engaged in a pretty well non-stop series of wars, mostly victories. Of course, they did it because they claimed to one and all that they were doing it for their own security. As I said, new rivals, they claimed, presented new threats. In fact, they presented opportunities for people to win battles and gain a lot of profit, capture a lot of slaves, bring them in to run the increasing Roman economy, and to provide more and more luxuries and services for the people who were doing very well out of it. So, as a famous British chieftain, I think, said that you conquered the entire world in self-defense, and Rome was not the first, and it certainly wasn't the last to attempt to do that. The excuse that these super aggressive powers nearly always use is self-defense. And each of these crises, each of these wars, each of these problems for Rome produced a general to deal with. This is a crude simplification, but there is a sort of pattern there. So I repeat, Rome was not taken over again by the Senate or the patricians or the People's Assembly or the mob or the equites. They were taken over by a series of successful generals. Those successful generals, I haven't got the time or the space to give a blow-by-blow account of what each one of them did. I'm going to have to throw a few names at you by way of example, but don't worry if you can't remember them all. It's very difficult unless you're a professional historian to call them up at the drop of a hat. But round about the year 100 BC, there was a very serious threat from some yet more Germanic tribes who were on the loose, round about the area of southwestern Germany today and the Alps, and they threatened the livelihood, the very lives, it seemed, of Rome, Italy, and the civilization they'd built up. They defeated some Roman armies which had been sent to deal with them, and the Romans had to look around for a gifted general to deal with the problem. Luckily, they found one. His name was Marius, Gaius Marius. Bit of a rough diamond, but effective, efficient, and successful. But in order to defeat these tribes, the Teutons, as they were called. We get our word Teutonic from it, and the Cimbri. They've disappeared from history. But the Teutons and the Cimbri, two Germanic tribes who were giving a great deal of trouble. And it took Marius several years to deal with them. In order to do that, the Romans once again showed their what's the word I want? Resilience and inventiveness. They were great believers in the rules, but they also believed in breaking the rules when the crisis dictated that it was necessary. And in this case, they broke the rule of the consulship. Marius was elected to 6 consecutive consulships in order for this defeat of the German tribes to be achieved. 20, 30 years later, there were another example of a crisis in Asia Minor, Turkey, today. And the general sent out, well, there were 2 actually. One was called Sulla, Lucius Cornelius Sulla. You may not have heard of him. When you see the name, Sulla, it's tempting to call him Sulla. But all the classical scholars pronounce it Sulla, so better do what they say, Sulla. Lucius Cornelius Sulla. He was sent to deal with trouble in Asia Minor. He was succeeded by another general, Lucullus, who finished off the job which Sulla had started. And Sulla returned particularly with an extreme amount of power and an enormous amount of loot. He was involved in trouble with the Senate. They didn't like the idea of him gaining so much power. And it ended up with Sulla marching his soldiers into Rome and taking it over. Sulla, in effect, was committing high treason and got away with it. Then in the 60s, there was a king of a country called Pontus. You won't know that either. It was the very north of what is modern Turkey today. He had a splendid name, Mithridates. And he was a thorn in the side of the Romans for decades. And this time, the general they found to deal with Mithridates was called Pompey, Pompey. Mithridates, one of the reasons for his resilience was the fact that he took great care to protect himself from the common assassination technique, namely poison. Apparently, he tried to, what's the word I want, vaccinate himself, if you like. He regularly took poisons for practice. In the end, Pompey did for him, and I think he took poison really in the end. But it took them a long time. Anyway, Pompey became a very powerful figure in Rome and emerged shortly afterwards as the great rival to Caesar. Pompey's an odd name. It's time you got used to the Roman trick of giving men usually 3 important men, 3 names. There's what they call the nomen, the main name, Gnaeus. That was a common name in Rome, like Gaius with Julius Caesar. Then you had a praenomen, which was the family name. So Gaius Julius Caesar, Gaius was his Christian name, if you like. Julius was the family name, the family tribe name, whatever you care to call it. And very often they established a personality or they achieved a particular feat, and the Romans accorded them a surname. In this case, Pompey achieved the somewhat surprising name of the Great, Pompey the Great, Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus. But for convenience, he's known to the historians and probably to his contemporaries as well, simply as Pompey. In Caesar's case, they used his third name, Gaius Julius Caesar. Sulla, they used his third name, Lucius Cornelius Sulla. Pompey was unusual. They took his second name. Pompey's contribution was to deal with a lot of pirates who infested the eastern Mediterranean. You see, when the Romans conquered all those countries in the eastern Mediterranean, many of those monarchs had been able to control the pirates in their particular area. But when the Romans destroyed their authority, it left a sort of power vacuum, and the pirates had a wonderful time with nobody to wrap their knuckles. And they were disrupting trade all over the place. They were a major threat. And it was Pompey who, in the course of 4 or 5 years, did for the pirates. So that helped to make his reputation. He made another reputation he had a lot of successes very early on. Perhaps that's why he got the nickname Magnus, I don't know. Then in the 50s, there was a further threat from the Near East, a country called Parthia, roughly where Iraq and Iran is now. And another Roman general decided that he would go and deal with them, a man called Crassus, Marcus Licinius Crassus. Here we have an exception. Nearly all the other generals I mentioned were very successful. Crassus came unstuck. He was not the greatest of generals, and he wasn't very used to it. He didn't do it very often, but he had been successful earlier on in putting down, the famous slave revolt of Spartacus. Crassus put that one down. Anyway, Crassus thought he would get a name for himself by conquering Parthia, and it all went wrong. And his army was defeated, and Crassus was killed. So it wasn't one unbroken list of successes. That was one that went wrong. Then it was time for Caesar to take a hand at it. Pompey had made this huge reputation for himself, and it was beginning to look as if there were going to be two major figures in Roman politics. Pompey had established his credentials, and it was time that Caesar did his too. Well, that's what he thought anyway. And in order to do that, he decided that it was time to make a military reputation for himself. Caesar came to soldiering quite late. Pompey had been doing it pretty well from his 20s. So Caesar looked around for a place to conquer. Mithridates was dead, the pirates were gone, the Parthians were enjoying their victory, and the Romans weren't going to venture there for a while. So Caesar looked west instead of east. And there was his country on the other side of the Alps. Remember I mentioned not only a Cisalpine Gaul on this side of the Alps, there was Transalpine Gaul, the big part of it, the France part of it, on the other side of the Alps. And Caesar decided he would carve a reputation for himself by conquering Gaul. Now, it sounds a bit glib, and it sounds a bit of a huge bite to take, but it turned out that Caesar was perfectly able to chew it. In the course of the next 4 or 5 years, he conquered Gaul. Not just like that, but Caesar conquered Gaul. He discovered, rather to his surprise and everybody else's, that over the age of 40, when he began, discovered that he was quite good at soldiering, and very good at soldiering, as it turned out. So he got a 5-year command to run a Gallic campaign. And that got renewed at the end of the 5 years too. So they gave him a huge amount of power. Then he was given further power to go in the other direction. There was trouble in Egypt. And Caesar was sent off to deal with it. That's where he met this young woman who was the Queen of Egypt, Cleopatra. Again, there isn't time to go into all the ups and downs and the ins and outs of that. The famous Cleopatra campaign and the Cleopatra legend is a saga in itself. Now, all those campaigns, all those generals, all those successes, except poor old Crassus, cost money, cost men, cost all sorts of things, these long, huge military commands. And it caused damage in the event, in reality, to the Roman state itself. This was the real cost. Because the more it went on, and the further away these generals went to fight their campaigns, the more their soldiers, their legions, depended on them. I've said this in a previous talk. The generals, one way to command the loyalty of these troops, campaigning month after month in godforsaken places in the back and beyond, was to say, don't worry, lads, when all this is over, I'll see you're all right. They looked to their generals for their pay, obviously, and for their retirement, when they looked forward to being given a small holding, maybe a bigger farm, somewhere nice, somewhere comfortable, somewhere warm, as near to Italy as possible, maybe. But they looked to their generals. They didn't look to the Senate. They looked to their generals. Remember that. The more these generals gained extra powers to do something, not just for 1 year, which was usual. They were voted powers for 3 years, 5 years. Caesar got his 5-year sitting bull extended. So, once again, as I said with Marius and his 6 consulships, the Romans kept on breaking the rules. More and more they were breaking the rules. The generals were tempted now and again to ignore the rules. There they were on their own, running the show, hundreds, possibly thousands of miles away from Rome. Weren't they tempted? Yes, of course they were. Until in the end, as I said in the case of Sulla, he disagreed with the Senate and finished up marching against Rome. Caesar did the same. At the end of his Gallic campaign, the Senate tried to checkmate him by stripping him of power, and he decided that the only way to survive was to march his army against Rome. He crossed the boundary of northern Italy, a little river called the Rubicon. That was the official boundary of the Roman state. And by crossing that, Caesar was entering civilian country at the head of an army. Like Sulla, he was committing high treason. It was one hell of a gamble. So the generals were getting more and more power. They had more and more support behind them in the shape of hopeful, optimistic soldiers. They had less and less respect for the rules. If a problem arose, it was not beyond the possibility that the generals in the end would cease to bother about the Senate and just do a deal between themselves. And the Senate was powerless to do anything about it. They would fix the consulship, you have a consulship next year and I'll see that Pompey get and so on. Playing politics, but they had the power with which to do it. Now, of course, this didn't go unnoticed by all the traditional, old-fashioned, sentimental, loyal Republicans who saw the system being ridiculed and ignored and pushed on one side. And to many of them, it seemed as if the Republic, which had lasted for 400 or 500 years, was now rotting from the centre. People were cocking a snook at its authority. Somebody ought to do something about it. The Senate had lost, or was losing, its moral authority. In the days of the Second Punic War, yes, the Senate were all heroes, and they pulled Rome through the worst crisis in its history. But they weren't doing that now, and they seemed to be helpless in the face of each succeeding further crisis. It was a dismal picture. What was it like to live there? One wonders. The results of this success, as I told you, one of the results was the rise of this new class, the businessmen, the equites, who were doing deals, just as the generals were doing deals, the equites were doing deals as well. And again, very often without the approval, possibly without even the knowledge of the old senatorial parties. They too bent the rule, as financiers always do. They had a lovely new empire with a small e to exploit, all that money to be made, all those contracts to be engendered and handled and taken advantage of. So the traditional Republicans who deplored what was going on increasingly felt that there was less and less that they could do about it. It was a pretty dismal picture. Another factor which had slowly appeared and was growing stronger, I've indicated this as well, is the famous Roman city mob. So he got to the stage where unscrupulous politicians could organize street mobs who could be called out at the drop of a hat. Rival politicians, it was not unknown for them to produce a rival organization of rival mobs, and they met each other and fought battles, pitched battles in the streets. And again, the Senate could do very little about it. If these generals wanted a campaign to succeed in and get their military command, all they had to do was find a tame tribune. Remember, tribunes have the power to propose laws. So get a tame tribune, get him to stand up in the Senate, propose the law, bribe enough people, you'll get it passed, and you'll get what you want. So having a group of people who could frighten others in the streets was one technique. Getting a tame tribune to propose the necessary law to get you what you wanted, that was another. Successful generals, very successful generals like Sulla, dealt with opposition by the simple procedure of eliminating them. When Sulla marched into Rome, his most notorious technique was what they called proscription. Not prescription, as you get from the chemist or the doctor. Proscription. The Latin word scripto is to write. Pro means out in front, up where everybody can see. Sulla did it by the simple device of producing a list, including or carrying the names of people he wanted to get rid of, and he nailed the list up in a public view, telling everybody that these people were not going to be in circulation much longer. Proscriptions. So he was committing high treason, he was committing murder, and there didn't seem to be anything anybody could do about it. It's outrageous when you think about that was what was going on. Mobs in the streets, proscriptions, executions, bribery, corruption. Not a very pleasant picture. While all this was going on, remember the politicians again, the demagogues, were making sure that the mob were given their dole of cheap bread, later on free bread, and that there were plenty of circuses and games for them to cheer at, to forget their hard life. Their lives probably were very, very hard indeed. Didn't mean to say they went to a set of games every day of the week. Of course not. But they went to a lot, and these games cost an enormous amount of money. While all this was going on too, you had the influence coming in increasingly from the east. Successful generals, after successful campaigns and captures of other cities, whole countries, one of the techniques of dealing with the manpower of a defeated nation, or the woman power as well, was to enslave them. You packed them all into boats and sent them off to Rome or wherever you wanted to and sold them all off in slave markets. And as wealthy Romans got wealthier and were tempted by more and more goodies from the East, the silks and the satins and all the other luxury foods, luxury wines, so they needed slaves to run exotic households and put on expensive meals. It was all, I suppose, if you take a really puritanical view, all corrupting. It's not doing their moral strength any good, is it? This was going on as well. Now, it's easy to throw up one's hands in horror and say, God, what a steamy cesspool of corruption the city of Rome must have been. Well, it probably wasn't quite like that. And I've no doubt hundreds of thousands of people went about their daily business as they had always done. They got up and they had a quick wash and they had a slight breakfast, a cheap breakfast, and off they went to do their job of work to earn enough money to stay alive. And if they were lucky in the afternoon, they went to the games, yes. But life went on. Traditional values were suffering. And it was felt that the East had a lot to blame. The generals had a lot to be criticized for. The Senate were allowing power to slip out of their hands. It was getting the state, as a lot of the Puritans, a lot of the old traditionalists would have said, state was going to the dogs. And from an historical point of view, to a certain extent, it was. And when Caesar was finally voted the dictatorship for life, then a lot of the traditionalists, in effect, threw up their hands and said, my God, what's the last 500 years gone for? We're stuck with a king again. No wonder a group of men wanted to murder him. So Caesar was duly murdered. Did that solve the problem? No, of course it didn't, because there was a huge move on the part of Caesar's supporters to take revenge on him. The old Republicans did not necessarily know exactly what to do in order to take advantage of the situation. There were all those soldiers of Caesar's who were looking forward to their pensions and their farms. And there were plenty of other equally ambitious politicians who wanted to take advantage of a very fluid situation. So it led to yet another civil war in the end. Caesar fought first civil war against Pompey. Pompey had been unlucky enough to be assassinated after the war had only been going for a year or so. And Caesar, as you know, was assassinated at the end of it. But before long, there were other people engaged in the fighting, trying to take over. Caesar had a lieutenant called Mark Antony. He also, by this time, adopted a young man as his son. Rome was very keen on adoption. If they found a likely young fellow, and they hadn't got a son of their own, and Caesar didn't. He had a son by Cleopatra, but he wasn't going to get far in Roman politics, and later on, he was duly dealt with, I'm afraid. So all the old big personalities, one by one, Marius had died in a civil war, Pompey was murdered, Crassus got killed in Parthia, Caesar was assassinated, Mark Antony lost his particular civil war and committed suicide. The only one who died is Sulla, died in his bed. Everybody else came to a sticky end, and the one who survived was Caesar's adopted grandson, who was adopted as his son. His name was Octavian. He was about 18, 19 years old, so young in political terms, bit of a dark horse. Nobody knew much about him. He kept a very low profile. Caesar hadn't pushed him forward very much. I suppose Caesar expected to live quite a few more years, so he didn't think it was necessary. But Octavian, his name was, when Caesar adopted him, he adopted his official father's name. So he became known as Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus. He emerged, as I said, as king of the castle, because all the others were dead. By this time, Cleopatra herself had committed suicide. Antony was dead. Crassus was dead. Pompey was dead. All the old guard were dead. Remember Cassius, who'd been the leader of the conspirators against Caesar, and Brutus? They were both dead. So Octavian was left. And he finished up running the Roman state. A rather cold fish. It's difficult to get much of a handle on Octavian's character. He doesn't come across, certainly not endearing. Caesar had some annoying parts about him, and he had some ruthless parts, but he did have great charm. He must have done. He was notorious as a serial seducer of senators' wives. He was also very good at borrowing money. He borrowed a huge amount of money from Crassus, and he owed money to a lot of other people as well. It was said that Caesar was carefully avoided at cocktail parties by rich Romans because they were afraid that Caesar would back them into a corner and charm them into lending him yet more money. But we don't know much. There are no stories that stick to Octavian. So it's rather sad in a way, a bit humorless, and certainly very shrewd, above his years, much more mature than the average 18 or 20-year-old, and as it turned out, as I said, a bit of a cold fish, and quite ruthless when it came to it. What we have by 31 BC, when Octavian had defeated Mark Antony and Cleopatra had run away to Egypt to commit suicide, we have Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus in charge of the Roman Empire. Later on, he adopted yet another surname called Augustus. The name is self-explanatory. He also called himself Princeps, Princeps. It's the Latin word meaning simply the chief. We have our word principal. So he was careful not to call himself emperor. Although we now know, looking back, that this marks the beginning of what we understand to be the Roman Empire. And when you publish, or when the historians publish their lists of emperors, top of the list, the first one is never Julius Caesar. It's Octavian, or as they became used to calling him, Augustus. From now on, Augustus ran what we now know to be the Roman Empire. He didn't call it the Roman Empire, and he didn't call himself the emperor. He called himself princeps, and he always maintained that the Republic hadn't changed. The official nomenclature was what they call the Senate of the Roman people. If you look at pictures illustrating Rome, if you look at inscriptions, even if you look at Hollywood films like Quo Vadis, you'll see published somewhere, stuck up on a huge notice, SPQR, which is Latin, obviously, Senatus Populusque Romanus. Senatus, the Senate, Populus, the people, Romanus, Roman. Now, what is the que doing there? QUE on the end of a word. The Romans had two ways of saying the word and. One was predictable, et. The French still say et, don't they? But they had a second method. They stuck the word QUE on the end of the second word. So the Senate of the people was Senatus Populusque. So you get the formula Senatus Populusque Romanus, SPQR, the Senate of the Roman people. So at last we have arrived at what everybody thinks they understand by the Roman Empire. The historians refer now glibly to the empire. They refer to Augustus as the first emperor. And it was to last, that was, remember, after what? 700 years. Rome was founded in 753 BC. And they didn't get what we call the empire for 750 odd years. And then it became, as I said, we call it the Roman Empire. And that was to last for another 500 years. And when that went, the eastern half of the empire, centered around Constantinople, was to last for another 800 years again. How about that?